Welcome, everybody. My name's Antonio Petrole. I am a data engineer with over a decade of experience, and I'm also the owner of my own business, Authentic Data Solutions. And today, with the help of Mugnano, who's also a data engineer and the owner of Mugnano Data Consulting, I'm here to talk about why now is the best time to make the switch from Greenplum Database to Apache Cloudberry Database. So I'd like to start with some historical context to talk about where Greenplum's been and where it is today before we talk about how it makes sense for you as a Greenplum user to move forward. So in 2003, Greenplum was founded based off of Postgres 8 and Bizgress. 7 years later, Greenplum was acquired by EMC Corporation in 2010, and in 2012, EMC and VMware decided to spin off some of their software assets, including Greenplum, into a new company called Pivotal Software, which is where Greenplum really found its home. Since Pivotal Software valued open source software strongly, in 2015, Pivotal decided to open source Greenplum Database and make it available to the wider open source community. 4 years later, in 2019, VMware acquired Pivotal Software. This acquisition brought Pivotal Greenplum Database back into VMware, but VMware continued to support the Greenplum Database development and its open source community and promise. In November 2023, Broadcom completed its acquisition of VMware, and Greenplum now fell under the Broadcom umbrella. In May 2024, nearly all of Greenplum's GitHub repos were archived and became read-only. The Slack workspace was deleted, and both the user and dev community email lists fell silent. Broadcom effectively made Greenplum closed source, thus ending the 9 years of community development and collaboration under open source Greenplum. So this decision has created a number of problems for existing Greenplum users. The first one being that if you're an open source Greenplum user today, you're actually left with no path forward other than purchasing enterprise Greenplum licenses for your environment. The community can no longer contribute to any mission-critical features and bug fixes that they might need for their workloads. And users have to rely on Broadcom R&D to prioritize and implement any and all changes that companies might need instead of them being able to collaborate and commit those changes themselves. Not only that, but the open source Slack, GitHub, and email groups that Greenplum users and developers use to communicate, propose changes, and share ideas have all been eliminated as well. And if you're an existing Greenplum enterprise customer, and perhaps you used open source Greenplum for environments like dev and test, for example, to save on costs, you now have unexpected costs that have come up because there's no open source Greenplum offering anymore. So while all of this was happening, there was actually another timeline that was happening in parallel as well, and that was for Cloudberry Database. In 2017, a group of ex-Greenplum software engineers actually forked open source Greenplum to build their own enterprise offering. In 2023, they actually decided to take the core database offering and make it open source. And now in November of 2024, that same open source database offering is actually incubating as part of the Apache Software Foundation. So let's talk about why now. Why right now does it make the most sense to make the switch from Greenplum Database to Apache Cloudberry Database? So as I mentioned before, Cloudberry was actually forked off of open source Greenplum. And because of that, it still currently uses a lot of the same familiar Greenplum utility names. So that would be things like gpstart, gpstop, gpstate, gpinit system. All of the utility names that you're already familiar with right now are all in Cloudberry Database. Cloudberry Database also has the same SQL interface as Greenplum. So the SQL queries that you have running today will run the same in Cloudberry. The way that I like to think about it is that moving to Cloudberry is very similar to moving to Greenplum 7. So if you're on Greenplum 5 or Greenplum 6 today, all you have to think about is what would it take to get to Greenplum 7, and that's effectively what it will take for you to get to Apache Cloudberry Database. It's worth mentioning, too, that Cloudberry actually has many of the same extensions that Greenplum has, things like HLL, for example, and PXF. And Cloudberry actually has the same exact architecture as Greenplum. So if you're familiar with the MPP distributed nature of Greenplum, you understand how Cloudberry works. So I want to talk about why now through the lens of two different personas, one being the line of business and the other being technical and engineers. For C-suite and management, there's a really big cost savings that you get for not having to pay for enterprise licenses. Not only that, but switching to a completely different database platform is high in risk and it's very expensive. You basically have to refactor the code and existing workloads that you have today, and you're working on a technology that you don't have expertise on, and it's going to take time for your team to ramp up to really leverage and understand how it works. If you were to make the switch to Cloudberry database, you actually avoid most of that risk and the expense. You get to use the same workloads, the same code, and all of the in-house knowledge and expertise that your team has developed over the years. You also get to avoid feature freezes by avoiding unplanned work. Everybody has a big backlog full of features and bug fixes that they need to deliver to their clients and customers, and nobody wants to have to stop that work in order to switch to a new data platform. We also currently have companies right now that are already offering enterprise support and professional services. So making the switch to Cloudberry is not something that you have to do on your own. So for the more technical folks, these are people like application developers, data analysts, and database administrators. As I mentioned before, Cloudberry has the same public interfaces as Greenplum. It has the same command line utilities. The SQL works the same. And there's very minimal, if any, changes that you'll have to make to your application and operational maintenance code. So shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to talk about Cloudberry's commitment to open source and the Apache Software Foundation. Cloudberry is officially incubating in the Apache Software Foundation as a podling. This means that users can contribute anything that they need for their use cases, just as they used to with Greenplum, whether that's features or bug fixes that need to happen. And also, Cloudberry can actually never go closed source like Greenplum did. So since Cloudberry is now a part of the Apache Software Foundation, now that it's open source, part of the Apache Software Foundation's promise is that you actually can't close source anything once it's part of it. So what happened to you with Greenplum cannot happen to you with Cloudberry. Not only that, but Cloudberry has a growing and active community today on channels like Slack, on GitHub, and on the Apache mailing lists. So I want to talk quickly about the current Cloudberry landscape. So as I mentioned before, Cloudberry is currently incubating as part of the Apache Software Foundation. We have the growing open source community, and we also have companies doing professional services and companies doing enterprise support. So whether that's professional services that you need in order to make the migration from Greenplum to Cloudberry, or that enterprise support that you need to make sure that if something were to go wrong, you're not left on your own to figure it out. So Cloudberry isn't just a fork of Greenplum. There's actually been a bunch of additional features that have been built into it. So, for example, GP Shrink. So I've been in the field for 10 years helping Greenplum customers, and this is something I've seen a lot. It's effectively the opposite of GP Expand. With Greenplum, you can expand your cluster and make it bigger, but you never really had a way to shrink your cluster back down if that's something that you wanted to do. Cloudberry actually does have that as a utility and a feature built into it. Not only that, but it has transparent data encryption. This is data encryption that happens completely transparent to your application. There's Kubernetes deployment support, things like being able to re-index your tables concurrently, and query pipelining, which is effectively a way to rewrite the queries that you pass to make them more efficient and more effective for the query engine to run. Cloudberry also has some exciting features coming. The one that I'm most excited for is the separate storage and compute feature. The first version of this is planned to be deployed on AWS, but this is effectively the ability to scale your storage and your compute completely independently of each other. We also have an integrated vectorized execution engine, which is a big performance improvement for queries and something that Greenplum does not have today. On top of that, we also have incremental materialized views, which I imagine you might be familiar with from other database technologies, which can also greatly improve query performance. So I actually want to talk about a success story that Lewis and myself had working with a customer, helping them migrate from Greenplum to Cloudberry database. So our customer has been a longtime Greenplum customer that's running at petabyte scale. They found moving to other databases to be too risky, too time-consuming, and too cost-intensive. And really what they were looking for was a way to spin up and tear down clusters quickly and affordably. They were effectively hoping to leverage this ability so they could spin up clusters for peak season processing and analysis, right? So you can imagine come holiday season, we want to spin up clusters to do some processing that we might not be doing during the rest of the year, either due to scale or use case reasons. There's also an effort here to prove out that whether or not Cloudberry would actually be a good replacement for their Greenplum deployment. And especially now that Greenplum has effectively gone closed source, there's no easy, affordable, or good way to spin up these clusters temporarily throughout the year other than paying for licensing for them for the year. So the project plan was pretty straightforward. Since our customer was using Greenplum on AWS today, we wanted to create a similar ease and feel for deploying Cloudberry. We ended up deciding effectively that it would be best to split the deployment into two aspects. There's the virtual racking and stacking of the hardware, and then there's the actual operating system configuration and database installation. And we wanted to make the deployment process highly customizable, but also simple with a one-click deployment experience. So the solution architecture ended up being AWS CloudFormation for the virtual racking and stacking of the hardware, and then using Ansible for everything that needs to happen on the operating system when it comes to installing Cloudberry. So AWS CloudFormation is primarily used for things like spinning up the servers, spinning up the networks, all of the security groups we need, and having them all work in tandem with each other. So the CloudFormation code was net new code for this project. Lewis and I didn't have code laying around that we could have used to just apply to this. However, we were able to take all of our previous Greenplum AWS expertise, all of the ways that you might tune AWS for Greenplum, as well as all of the ways that you might look for cost savings for Greenplum AWS. We were able to take that knowledge and apply it directly to Cloudberry. And for our Ansible code, this was primarily used to do everything that would need to be done as prerequisite tasks, as well as the installation itself for Greenplum. So in our case, this was things like configuring the operating system, setting the kernel settings, mounting and formatting the disks, and also installing and starting the database. What was really nice is that this was actually pre-existing code that we've been developing and using for Greenplum for years. It would have taken us quite a bit of time to have to write this from scratch for a new database technology. But since we had this pre-existing code that worked with Greenplum and that we've developed specifically for Greenplum for years, and since Cloudberry is so similar, it actually required almost no changes. We were basically able to drop a Cloudberry RPM into our Ansible, and everything kind of just ran and installed exactly as we expected it. This saved us a lot of time, it saved our customer a lot of time, and it was really nice because we didn't have to reinvent the wheel or learn a new technology. We just took exactly what we knew about Greenplum, applied it to Cloudberry, and everything worked. So for the installation, as I mentioned, any knowledge you have on Greenplum cross-pollinates really well with Cloudberry. For Lewis and myself, as I mentioned, we were able to take all of our expertise we've developed over the years and our pre-existing knowledge and tool sets that we've built for Greenplum and apply it to Cloudberry. So again, that's installation prerequisites and best practices, our Greenplum 7 existing scripts and tools that we've built, things that do installation, maintenance, and day 2 operations just worked out of the box, and knowing which utilities we're supposed to be using during the installation and customizing the environment. Again, this is things like GPNet system and GP config. We just knew off the back of our hand because, again, it's the same in Cloudberry as it is in Greenplum. And while Lewis and I were able to put together the code that was required in order for our customer to easily spin up and tear down Cloudberry environments, our customer is the one who actually did the migration. And just as we did, they were able to take all of their pre-existing knowledge, code, and expertise that they've built over the years that they've been using with Greenplum and apply it to Cloudberry. So this was things like query and system tuning, database maintenance and performance best practices, database administration tasks, and there was minimal changes that were required for their existing applications and code that they had. So while we were working on the project, not everything went perfectly. But since Cloudberry has this open source community, they were actually there to help us. So Ed Espino, for example, he was able to build RPMs to the specs that we needed for the customer. So instead of us having to build from source, we asked Ed, hey, can you build us an RPM so we can install it and we can focus on delivering value to our customer? And Ed delivered it for us. And not only did Ed deliver it for us, but now it's available to everybody on the Cloudberry GitHub. It just goes to show that if you run into a problem and you build a solution with open source, everyone else can now leverage that solution and nobody has to reinvent the wheel. Our customer also ran into an issue with GP Backup and Restore, which they were trying to use to assist with the data migration. And when they identified that issue, they were able to open an issue on the GitHub. A patch was provided very quickly, and they were able to use it to assist in the data migration. Any questions that we had were received very quickly with feedback on the open Slack channels, and I'm very grateful that we had the community available to help us through this migration effort. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching this video. If you're interested in learning more about Cloudberry, you can visit the Slack, GitHub, the LinkedIn page, and the Apache mailing lists. All of the links for these will be in the description of this video. And if you're interested in working with Lewis and I, doing anything around Cloudberry or Greenplum or have questions, you can visit our websites at mugnanodc.com and authenticdata.io. Thank you again for your time.